This is a Film Stories original podcast. We made this.
So, Russ, what would you say is your favorite Vietnam movie?
That's a tricky question, as most of them are mildly depressing, which is good. I mean, that's largely the point. I think an effective war picture should be. It's hard, like something like Platoon has many great things about it. It's hard to call it my favorite. I haven't seen The Deer Hunter for a long time, but when I saw it in the 90s, I thought it was pretty impressive. But I'll probably have to go with Apocalypse Now, even though it's still some of the humor and the catchphrases in popular culture have made it worn a little bit thin. I'll defer and say that era of film and that setting of film is something I haven't visited for a long time, so I'm a bit out of practice. How about you?
Oh, well, that's a totally solid choice, of course. I'm going a little bit off board, and have you ever heard of a movie called Dogfight with River Phoenix and Lily Taylor?
It's a great film, yes.
I think it sort of brings home the experience. Vietnam itself is not in the movie an incredible a lot. It moves to that portion later, but the feel and the tone of what it was like and how disconnected the veterans felt when they came home, I think it really does that well.
That's a fun choice.
Okay, anyway, let's talk about some X-Files. Welcome to the X-Cast, The Truth is in Here. Today we'll be talking about what I consider one of the underrated episodes of Season 4, Unrequited. I'm your host, Paige Schector, and with me is X-Cast patron Russell Hugo, hashtag HughGhostInTheMachine. Hey, Ghosty!
Howdy, Paige. Thanks for letting me join you today.
Oh,
and for the hashtag. It'll help my morale.
I love your hashtag, and I like calling you Ghosty, too, so if you don't like it, let me know, and I'll stop.
It does not bother me. No, it's an improvement.
Okay, before we get into the nuts and bolts of this episode, let's do our patented 5 questions of X. When did you first discover the X-Files?
I was riding home from school with my neighbor, and they had just seen the pilot. I think this is late elementary, early junior high. I can't remember exactly when. And I'm sure I could if I backtracked it, but I'm lazy. And they were talking about this show and described every scene in detail. And so the next week I started with Deep Throat.
Wow.
There you go.
That is so quick. So you were really in on it right away.
Yeah. And also where I was at, we were fairly rural. And so we maybe got 2-3 channels fairly well. And one of those happened to be Fox. So, hey, we got lucky on that end. So, how about you?
Oh, you know what? I totally can't remember the answer to this question, which is so like me on many fronts. I just don't remember when it was. I know it was early. I'm remembering something about videotapes, but I don't know if it was just the fact that when the videos came out, I got more interested in it. I remember loving Eve, so I always consider that either how I started or the episode that got me so entranced and, obsessed with it. So I really, like many of the X-Files witnesses, I can't remember.
Still, that's a good episode to potentially have come in on.
Yes. Okay. And what is your favorite episode?
Oh, boy. This is one that we could talk about for hours, as there's so many different genres of episodes, and I have a favorite for each of those. And in the end, that's cheating. And I had to decide the one that I think encapsulates what I liked or loved about the show early on. And that was the feeling and the atmosphere. What I appreciate about it now is a little bit different, but that's something that kind of got me into it. And I'm going to have to go with Darkness Falls for that reason.
Oh, I love that choice. We don't hear that much when people say, what's your favorite episode? So what was it? Just everything? That is like textbook X-Files, Vancouver in the woods.
Yeah, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, near where that episode is intended to take place in the Olympic Peninsula. And it was the first time on television that I'd ever seen anything accurately portray that environment and just feel that the cold and the damp and the trees that well on television and make it spooky. It's obviously, objectively, it's not the greatest story, it's not the greatest direction or any of those things, but it has the atmosphere to it, then also the beats of the story and the fact that it ends on such a down note. And they get out of it alive, but they don't get out of it unscathed.
Right.
To see something like that on television where there are these repercussions, and then has the traditional X-Files ending with the government ambiguity to the crisis. Going through the first season, for some reason that episode just connected with me. I probably watched it 20, 30 times when I was a kid. I loved it. How about you? What's your favorite?
Well, this question I have answered before because I've done the Jose Chung's from Outer Space podcast, and it's not only my favorite episode of the X-Files, it's my favorite episode of television. And what I love about it is always seeing something new in it, because it's so dense. There's so much information, and there are like in-jokes and things that harken back to other things, and that's what I really love about it. In addition to, Charles Nelson Riley is just killing it, and Mulder yelping, and all these people who really believe the things they're saying. Like, no one is saying something just to say it. They believe absolutely everything they think they've seen or done. And so you don't really know where the truth is. But what I love the most is it gave me made me look again at all of it. Is the conspiracy actually the government covering up what it's doing by making people think they're abducted by aliens? And so there's a deeper reason I love it beyond, boy, it makes me laugh.
Not to jump on that train, but that episode and Beyond the Sea were my two runner-ups for favorites. And Jose Chung's from Outer Space is a phenomenal piece. And the fact that it actually works, it's so opaque, and we could say jumbled, but it actually does work as a narrative, and it works with humor, and the plot actually makes sense if you sit down and look at it, and then it actually has some heart and philosophy to it,
right?
And the way that it lands with the pathos, the ending of it, I think, is perfect.
Isn't it? In a similar way to how Forehead Sweat sort of recapped where the X-Files were at that juncture, where the ending of Jose Chung lands is very similar, and makes you think. I mean, you spent your whole episode laughing at different things that he's come up with, and at the end you're like, oh, well, that's true, isn't it?
And you feel.
And
the heart gets those strings plucked just a little bit, too.
Yes. Okay, so what is your favorite season?
I'm going to go with one. I mean, it's not where the X-Files hits its stride or intellectually or artistically necessarily, but season 1 has this feeling of mystery and there's this cloud around it. And I guess it captures that Vancouver aspect of where you can be in this big city in the big world, but it's so cloudy and rainy. Everything outside of that space is a mystery. And season 1, you just have no idea where anything is going to go. The self-contained episodes just have a different feeling to it. Even Scully's character, I actually prefer. Not that I disprefer where it goes, but that dynamic and the energy that Gillian Anderson brings in season 1, I think, is one of my favorites. An example like Beyond the Sea, there's a beat to the way that everything's delivered and everything feels that I really miss the energy of it. And I love the later seasons. It's not a knock, but there's something about season 1 and the roughness, the chaos, and the mess of it, the imperfections, and even the way it looks so dated. I don't know. How about you?
Oh, well, I love the choice and the reasons there. I guess I would say season 3 overall, just because beyond the fact that Darren Morgan episodes are in there, that the mythology is in a place where it's not overwhelming or confusing. So that part is still interesting, and the standalones are really interesting and thought-provoking. But if I have to admit this, the season I go back to more than any to watch is season 6. Maybe, they call it X-Files Light. Maybe that's why, because it's so easy to just watch and laugh or whatever. And there are so many little gems in season 6. So I go to 3, and then right on the heels of that would be 6.
Great choice. Yeah, if I was going to introduce someone to X-Files, season 3 is a great place to do it.
It definitely, I agree. Okay. Who is your favorite character?
This is a tricky one. I was going to cheat and say Frank Black, because he's technically in the X-Files. But that's not nice. And again, Jose Chung too is a good one, but I'm going to go with X. Even though there's not necessarily too much to the character, what is given to the character, and Merchant's portrayal is so intense and on the money and sells it. It could be really stiff or cheesy at so many points, but he's probably my favorite character. How about you?
Well, I would like to pick Detective Manners, but I don't want to pick someone who was just on once. So I will pick my actual favorite is Alex Krycek, because you never knew where he was going to go or where his allegiance was going to be. He was so malleable. He could be on any side. He could be on Mulder and Scully's side, even though they wouldn't believe it. And his final episode, he's holding hands with Deana. I mean, it's so bizarre. But I just love how you just didn't know where he was going to go. And so that made him able to do many, many things, including being a hero and being a villain.
And a great actor, too. He's another person that they really scored with the energy he brought to the show.
Absolutely. I love Nick. And as I always say, he got better looking, too, so that kind of made me entranced as well. But that's besides the point.
Not really. It counts. You can add that to the tally.
And he's the nicest man. I hope every X-File fan gets to meet him, because he takes the time to talk with you and he wants to know about you. He doesn't just want to answer questions like, what was your favorite episode? He actually will talk to you and find out who you are as a person. He's lovely. Okay, final question, what is your favorite moment from the series?
Well, you kind of solved it for me, because I was tied between the very end of Jose Chunks from Outer Space and the end of Beyond the Sea.
Aww. Okay, and why?
For that time in television, and considering the show that it was, to land that ending with such emotional nuance, and Anderson selling the heck out of it, I think is rare. And going back and watching it and how effective it still is, considering a lot of the beats that could be dated, it's an incredible achievement, I think, and a really wonderful moment.
I love your choices. They're so unique, but totally on. That's what I like about them.
You're too nice.
No, I'm speaking the truth. Mine is in the Red and the Black, when Krycek comes to Mulder, and not them having, their usual loaded with extra insinuations conversation about what he does with his arm, but more because Krycek totally gets Mulder back into the game in the course of that one conversation. That season, Mulder is not believing in aliens. He believes the conspiracy is just a cover-up, and it takes Alex Krycek to get him back onto the path which we know him best from. And I love the intensity of that scene. It's just always the one that I look at and go, that's the one right there.
Speaking of fun choices, Paige, I hadn't really, it's been a while since hasn't been that long, but it's been a while since I watched that arc and made the connection of really how important Krycek is in that. So kudos, and great choice.
I would totally, what I love about your choice is that I would ordinarily think of in Beyond the Sea is when Scully is yelling at him, at Brad Dourif, and how she goes up in volume and intensity. And it's just so, it's measured, but it's not. It's controlled, but it's not. But I didn't think of the last scene. So kudos to you in return. It's a mutual admiration society.
Best friends forever.
Okay, best friend, let's get into the episode that it wasn't one of the blockbusters of the 4th season. Actually, episode 16 was the second lowest rated of that year, behind the one that came right before it, Kaddish, with a 10.9 rating and a 16 share and 16.56 million viewers, which would actually be a lot by today's standards, but then seemed low. But it does rate a 7.5 at IMDb, which I think is a completely respectable score. I think Unrequited is a very solid and kind of thought-provoking and spooky show, and I liked it very much from the very first airing. But what was your reaction to it?
I'm looking forward to talking about this with you. It's great to I'm going to enjoy learning what about it grabs your attention. I did not find a lot to connect with in the episode. A lot of the issues, I think, fall on direction. Some decent ideas in here, some decent writing, but the energy of it and the pacing and the way things connect and flow, it's off. And emotionally, there wasn't much going on in the episode, and some of the actors seemed a bit disinterested. Overall, I am going to unfortunately agree with the masses and say that this is one of the weaker episodes. It's nothing that, like, oh, I hate this episode or I wish it didn't exist. But, you've got to have some weaker episodes when there's stronger episodes. It's the nature of the beast, and this one falls in the bottom half for me.
Oh, well, I totally understand that. And when we talk about pacing, I mean, the episode starts with a scene that later comes back without really adding more to it. I think if you're going to recast a scene you've had in the same episode, give it some different, give it a different look, give it a different meaning. And for that reason, I totally understand, especially when you talk about pacing, that it's off in this episode.
And when I just rewatched this, I think I was eating popcorn or something, and I looked down right after the cold open where it says 12 hours earlier. So I didn't make the connection this time that what we had seen was in the future. And I thought, oh, that's kind of neat to start mid-case. And I thought, okay, that was the first time the assassin had gone. And I was like, oh, this would make sense. And I later realized, oh, no, that did happen in the future. But the episode was not doing anything to build tension with that timeline. It just kind of felt like this is happening and they're more worried about what's going to happen, but there wasn't any countdown or there wasn't a real push towards that moment. And then when that came back up around, it's like, oh, that's right, that was in the cold open and we're here. And then your point that not much else happened except for sort of a mild Deus Ex friendina, I don't know how to say that comes out and shifts, that resolves the situation as we would see, we might think. But anyways, we can get into that more. I don't need to monopolize.
No, I like where you're going with that. Let's talk a little bit about what it's about, just to remind everybody. So there's this guy, Nathaniel Teeger, who was in Vietnam, and apparently he was left there by the government, and he was a POW. And then he gets liberated by this other group that's led by Detective Manners. Because it's the same guy, Larry Musser, back again with us. And he was liberated by them. And now he's killing off the people he considers responsible for leaving him and insinuating that there are other POWs still there, still in Vietnam at the time of, when this episode aired, who haven't been taken care of, who have been forgotten. And he's getting a measure of revenge. One of the hardest things to take about this episode is the idea that he disappears in people's vision. And so that's how he's able to kill them, which is also, to me, one of the most interesting things. The invisible assassin who he's sitting right in front of you, but you can't see him. I think that's so scary.
I agree. I think the idea has potential, but the way it's explained And especially towards the end, it doesn't match anything that we've seen. And so it's hard to buy into. It's nice that they try to come up with a physical, medical explanation with a slight supernatural edge, as opposed to he can just turn invisible in the sense that he's able to generate like blind spots in the eye. But that's not really what's happening when we get our POV shots, because you're able to see through him, and other people are not looking directly at him and still can't see him. You would think there would be more like out of the corner of the eye. So there isn't a consistency to it. It had potential, but I'm not sure it landed.
Well, the thing I always think of is, if we're saying people have these blind spots and this scotoma, and one of the wives who meets with him, then her capillaries burst in her eye and she starts bleeding. Don't all the people who have been involved, like Mulder and Scully, don't they now have eye problems? It's like when they told us not to stare at the eclipse, and if you actually did, do you now have an eye problem? Do all these people who have been in this guy's vicinity now have bigger eye problems?
Exactly. That's kind of a smart writing that the wife, her eyes, first because of the emotional stress. But that's something right. I was thinking, too, the entire time was you don't have to look at the person. You just have to be around them, it seems. But there's also a hint that it's a technique, so maybe he has to concentrate. It's left a little ambiguous, and then that's fine. The ambiguity's fine in the sense of how he does it, but it's more of how it actually functions is where it falls a little bit.
Right. So the script is written by Howard Gordon, who, of course, is legendary in the X-Files circles. And I think he went on to Homeland, where he really was able to write what he was thinking, with more clarity than he can do in a 44-minute episode, especially one that uses the same scene twice. But he does the greater point that he makes about how, first, when they came home from Vietnam, they did not come home to this hero's welcome. There was hostility to all the Vietnam veterans. And then eventually people realized, they went over and they were fighting for their country. They weren't doing anything wrong. And because you oppose the war doesn't mean that they weren't doing everything they could for America and believing in their cause. But then the idea that, I don't know why it would be just a 3-man commission in charge of, okay, we're going to leave these guys behind. The ideas about the people coming home from war and how he taught, he runs into a fellow veteran and he says, that guy says, the war is over. And Teager says, well, it's not over for me and it's not over for the ones still there. And that's what this episode, I don't know if it was the first thing that taught me that, but when people come home from war, they're not the same. And it's not just because a ceasefire has been declared. They've been through something. And these people in this particular episode have been through more than we can even fathom. So that's what the X-Files taught me, I believe.
Yeah, I give them credit. I'm not sure. I know the POW thing is, in real life as a conspiracy theory, controversial. But you have to sympathize with the concept if there is any truth to it. Although I've read a lot of skeptical remarks even about the 90s about it. But I don't think it, and that's fine in the X-Files to play with it, but I agree with you, and I think it's not really necessary even in the story, in that in reality that you can think of most veterans, but Vietnam as an example, were neglected upon return by the government as well. And I grew up near a Vietnam mental hospital in a small town and saw firsthand as a kid, as how I was exposed to it, the limited care provided by our government for the veterans. And these people had severe mental trauma from what happened over there and could barely function in society. And on one hand, kind of wish that the episode would have played a little bit more about that. And Teager does make that comment that the war is over for me, but it can be read that in the sense it's because solely of the POWs over there. And necessarily, they don't have to deal with both aspects of the lasting trauma or the potential for neglect. But it's often in these narratives that it's the social as opposed to the structural and the federal aspects. Some things like Born on the 4th of July, I think, do a good job of exploring the the structural problems, and even Platoon. So I just think something more could have been done. Teager does not come across as someone who went through what someone like that would have gone through. He just seems like a cold, grouchy assassin and not somebody who was traumatized. And I don't know how anybody could go through that without being severely traumatized. Maybe you could, but I think the character it would have been more interesting if the character had more sympathetic angles. The fact that you were able to see the emotional wounds, see what they were dealing with, and make them less just like a cold-faced killer who's out for revenge. I would have been able to connect a little more with the episode.
I think that's why they gave him that scene. And the character is played by Peter LaCroix, who we'd seen before as Ranheim in EBE and Dwight in Ascension. They give him that scene with the wife, and I think that humanizes him a little. I definitely see what you're talking about. I find him sort of intense, and he's got this direction. Apparently a newspaper article or something, it had been reported recently in this time frame that this commission was in charge of leaving these people behind, and I think he's focused in on getting these three guys. And so we're not seeing any of this world weariness or anything like that, because he's this Green Beret, this guy who was in the Bloody Sabres, who's on a mission, and his mission is to get these guys because they did this to him. He's probably seen all of, everybody else in his unit who was shot down and is a POW. He's living with that. So I definitely understand what you're saying. I feel like, these guys in that group were trained assassins, and so he has this target and he's going to do it. And then maybe after that, then he falls apart. I don't know. That's my excuse for it anyway.
Yeah, and I don't want to stereotype veterans as damaged or hurt people or make any assumptions like that. I think your point is very fair. As a focused assassin, it just didn't come across that interesting to me, in the sense of we don't really have a mystery in this episode other than the Marita reveal about the government and the commission. We're told right from the beginning who the killer is. We know why they're doing it for the most part. And the fact that they don't go anywhere with it, they could have gone somewhere and at least just explored the character a little bit more, but we don't get that. And then they had that moment with his friend where I think they could have right there easily touched on some things, but they didn't, and it just is slightly brushed off. Added a little bit of depth, but your argument regarding the focus, I think, is totally legitimate, and I subscribe to that.
Well, there are a lot of things that you just said that I agree with, but I kind of like the fact that we know who it is, and Mulder and Scully know who. Well, Mulder knows who it is, and Scully thinks it's a scam of some sort. I like the fact that they know that, and they can't do anything to stop it. It gives it an extra heightened sensibility for me. How, usually it's like, let's find out who this bad guy is, but now they know it. Mulder knows the guy is coming after the general, the second victim. He knows he's coming after him. He even warns him, and he still can't stop it. And I love how heightened that makes all of it for me. It's not like just, if Mulder knows what the answer is, then the mystery is solved. Then there's still more drama to be had there. So what you don't like about it is kind of like what I like about it.
No, I will clarify myself. I agree, and in my notes I even wrote that it's an interesting change of pace, that it gives up the main mystery in the cold open, and that is something I did like. I just think that at that point, we know everything about the character, and every time they're introduced, you could have done something. Each time they're confronting with the general, there could have been a short character beat when every time we interact with Teager or something about it, but we don't learn anything new and we don't explore it. So it has nothing to do with like a fault with the narrative or the plot. It's more of what I think is a missed potential to enrich the character and then the story on that hand, because the story tries to have this big emotional resonance with patriotism, but there isn't any real human element, and they had multiple opportunities throughout the entire episode to add some humanity to it. That's all.
Right.
I agree with you. I think it's a nice change of pace. I mean, we get how many episodes a year, and to go with something that's just hits the ground running. But then the fact that I didn't really feel the tension, going back to the first point when we started talking, that with the flash forward and that we've got this countdown and we got to solve it, they don't really capitalize on it. It makes it harder to ignore some of the other potentials. But it's a minor point.
Right. Well, of course, one of the biggest areas in which they could have sort of beefed up the episode is Skinner. I mean, Skinner's in this episode. I've always sort of considered it a Skinner episode, but it's not in terms of his own story. He just happens to be in it more than he is in a usual episode that's not focused around what he's doing. And I think his presence carries a lot of weight in this episode, but the script doesn't really reflect that until the end. It's sort of more working off our personal knowledge of his backstory based on what we've seen before this point in the series.
I totally agree, because I hadn't seen this episode in a long while, and I kept waiting for some moments where the characterization of Skinner would occur. I guess that'll happen in Avatar, or I'm not sure, and I guess Kitten now.
Right.
Yeah, it was a little bit disappointing in that there were just so many opportunities. But, when he was on screen, Mitch Pileggi, as always, did great.
Yeah, and it's great to see him in charge of. So, of course, it's an operation that they sort of Marita, and I think, for me, this might be the best use of her character on the show. I never thought that she fit in properly, and so I didn't like her because of that. I wanted to like her more than I ultimately did. So in this episode, she adds something that's not going to be picked up anywhere else, that the idea that the government wants this three-man commission to be taken out, and they assigned their own people to watch over these military guys because they know they can't be stopped. Well, if you know they can't be stopped, you shouldn't put the X-Files in charge of it, because they can stop almost anything. But I love how she contributes in this episode, and it gives me more than I can't think of any other episode where I've appreciated where she fits into the fabric more.
Yes, you raised 2 points there that I think are worth exploring. I've never really connected with the character, and it's not, this may be unfair, but I think Laurie Holden does not play the character as if they're a government official. It feels more like trying to be a special ops, or even like a femme fatale kind of an energy to it. And I think just as with a few direction tweaks, she obviously is talented, and just tone it down a little bit drier, she could have made some of the interactions a little bit more convincing and not so dramatized. I would have connected a little bit more. Just to have somebody sort of like Senator Matheson, but even maybe a little bit drier, would have helped me with the character. But I do want to get back to the point you raised about the main mystery that comes up about the idea that the government knows about that it's unstoppable, and puts the X-Files on there as a way to both cover it up, and then Mulder's supposition that it's also a way to discredit the X-Files. I think that is a really nice twist and idea, and I got to give the writer credit for that. I'm not sure it lands fully, but I do think it's a real highlight of the episode.
I definitely agree. I'm just so amazed that, it's funny when you watch, and as you told us earlier, you've been watching since the original run. When we watched an original run and we didn't have this kind of outlet that we have now with podcasts and Facebook groups for talking about things, you never really realized that people didn't see things the way that you do. Do you know what I mean? Like, maybe you didn't realize, I don't know, well, This is my best example. Like, I thought Unrequited was I don't think it's the best episode, and we just recently did, what are your 5 most underrated episodes in our X-Files Basement Facebook group, and it's not one of my 5, but I really didn't realize that people didn't take to this episode? And is it because it's also, in addition to the fact that it's not completely compact, I think the bleakness of it might have an effect on that. But do you know what I mean about people, about having watched an original run and now your opinions are what they were then, but people have opinions from coming in afterward?
Oh, definitely. I think this even happened to me post that, in that I didn't watch the X-Files all the way through. I kind of fell off around season 3 and disappeared once Fight the Future came out, and I came back around through Millennium. This whole long story that I want to believe. And I did a rewatch maybe like 4 or 5 years ago. And some of the episodes, I wasn't that familiar with what the fandom expected, but things have been fossilized. And some episodes, like The Rain King, have like a big group of people who hate it. And I'm thinking, it's innocuous. Or Arcadia. And I go, I don't get it. They're fun. They're not perfect, but you've got hundreds of episodes. Why is this a problem if it's deviating? But there are very intense opinions about what an episode should be or what a show could be. And one thing I love about the X-Cast, and in particular, is that it's, I think, a place where people can express these opinions like yours for these episodes that aren't loved, and be not something anyone's going to get angry about or attack you. And then it's not that much fun for a show like the X-Files to go through and just, I hate this episode, and have that reinforced. It's an imperfect show. That means there's good things in there, and the fact that people like you can come on and defend it and highlight and say, no, these are some ways to appreciate it, and something else that we can get out of the episode, as opposed to just be blinded by anger. On your point, this raises something, maybe, I don't know if this is of interest or not, but are you familiar much with Doctor Who, classic Doctor Who and Doctor Who fandom?
Yes.
Okay, so do you know about the discontinuity guide?
No, I don't know that, so I'm semi-familiar.
Hey, I don't want to put everybody to sleep, but there's this idea that of received wisdom in that community about what is a good episode and what is a bad episode is so strong. And I'm sure this happens in a lot of fandom. But at one point, there was this book written by a lot of, at the time, influential writers for book series of the show, kind of going back, and, media people going back through each episode and writing a commentary, and how for like 20 years until the internet came about and podcasts and people could actually start discussing it, these narratives about the episodes were able to be broken down, where like it was, you'll hear people talk about, I didn't realize this was a good episode. I didn't know I was allowed to like it. Or I didn't know this was a bad episode and I was allowed to criticize it. So it's one of those dreams of media, is I would love someone to be able to, erase a small portion of my mind so I can rewatch, X-Files from scratch. I've never seen it before, Twin Peaks season 1 and 2, not knowing what's going to happen. But we don't have that option. And instead what we can do is talk to people. I can talk to somebody like you and listen to people on the X-Cast and get my view changed. So the next time I watch it, I get to see it a little bit new and a little bit different. And your point is well made, and it's something that's fantastic. So kudos for defending Unrequited. And if you can bring your passion from the past before received wisdom of fandom and negativity taints it, hey, kudos.
Well, that's a good, but of course now I'm seeing it also the way that you're seeing it, and I'm like, wow, this is a disconnected mess, isn't it? I guess I had a scotoma there. I was just looking at it a different way. No, but I still think it's just really interesting. And the character development is certainly not there. But the idea of these veterans, and we're not seeing what they went through in the way that we see in all these Hollywood movies. It's just someone who's got revenge on his mind. And so when these generals have to pay for what they did, and I particularly like the general having to pay for it. Well, he doesn't actually pay for it, but he's on stage talking about how these Vietnam veterans were forsaken and they should have come home to a hero's welcome, but they didn't. And I really like how intense it is about that. It's bleak and it's dark and it's telling you something, or it told me something at the time that I hadn't been thinking of, that these veterans are scarred, whether or not they were POWs or what they went through, even if they were in Vietnam for one day, had they been there one day, is more than we can ever fathom having not been there. And it really brought me a whole new measure of a way to look at it, which is what Howard Gordon later does in Homeland. I got so entranced by Homeland, and I think it's very similar to the reasons why I took to Unrequited, seeing something from a different viewpoint that I hadn't considered before.
Yeah, and to be fair, that's great. And in a 45 or however minute episode, you only have so much you can talk about. And the fact to focus on the one idea of the missing POWs, that's fine. It's just some of the beats were so repetitive that they could have added more complexity that I kind of had an issue with. There's so much patriotism, iconography thrown in our faces, but it just seemed like the Merida thing, the issue that the government is behind the neglect of the POWs. I just think that also could have been exploited more in the general speech. The direction could have been a bit more intense. They could have talked about, Mulder could have talked a little bit, just even a line or two about how the government treated the veterans, or the draft, or all of these complexities or things that happened. There was just a lot of wasted time that could have fleshed it out more. If it was a tighter script and it had that momentum, I don't think I would care. And I think let's just focus on the missing POW thing. Let's just do the assassin and go through it. So that's one of the reasons when we first started talking about this, I put a lot of the blame on the direction. And I still stand by that. The direction and the editing. Right.
Okay. The director was Michael Lang, and this was the last of 4 episodes he had done for the show, which included Young at Heart, Miracle Man, and Ascension. And Ascension, what we consider one of the most exciting episodes. And then if you think about it, though, that episode has a real heightened portion of it. And then it sort of drops off. And so it's intense and really action-packed for 20-minute span. And then they get to the part where they're all at the hospital or wherever they are with Dwayne Barry, and it sort of drops off. The pacing, I definitely admit the pacing is strange, and I still don't understand the repetition of scenes. Like, if I was going to repeat one scene in the episode, it might not have even been that one. I mean, like, who cares where the guy says Section 3 is coming to you? It's not really as intense as some of the other images in there. And then you have this guy from the organization The Right Hand, who seems to be involved but is not really involved at all. I guess he just serves to give some more background on Tiger. And all that scene really makes me do now is think of the gag reel, because when the dogs are chasing Mulder and Scully, if you've seen the season 4 gag reel, the dogs get through the fence. And so when I get to that portion of it, all I see are the dogs getting through and them laughing about it. The impact is definitely lost there for me.
I haven't seen the gag reel, but I did notice this time when I was watching that when the dogs chase them, it cuts back to them running the third time, and both the gates are fully open. And then when it cuts back, both gates are closed and just the door is open. So there's a little continuity issue there, too.
I don't want to bust on them, but
No.
I think getting back to what you said a couple minutes ago, the strongest line of the script is saved for the last line of the script. With all due respect, sir, it could be you. And that's something that could have been so much more in the episode, but is not used until it hits home pretty well there at the end. But it doesn't. It might have been better served to use it during the other 45 minutes of the episode.
And also, why didn't Skinner get to confront any of these people? Is a big missed opportunity to have a dialogue between Skinner and the guy from The Right Hand, or between Skinner and Tiger, and have a debate. That is a big missed opportunity, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think if we could do revisionist history and change things, I think that maybe even the show would see that Skinner should have been the focus of this episode, and it would have given it even more impact. Okay, let's see what we got from the mailbag from the X-Files basement on Facebook. Clara Jean Cook said, I feel like this episode had a lot of potential. There was a lot of possibilities in a story about an assassin that can make himself invisible. The fact that the episode was also about Vietnam veterans could have meant Skinner could have had more of a bigger role in it. But ultimately it fails because we are never given a clear reason as to why Tiger is killing people. The episode does contain a nice close-up of David Duchovny's eyes. Oh, see, we neglected to mention that. Really nice shot of Duchovny's eyes. I'll agree with that.
When was that?
It's when he's looking out of the corner of his eye, and I think he thinks he sees Tiger, but then he looks directly, and then he can't see Tiger.
Oh, is that in the opening, or when they're at the right hand and he sees him standing out in the woods?
It's later. It's definitely not in the opening. This is the way I'm remembering that he's sitting down and he kind of looks to the side, if this is the moment Clara's talking about, and I hope she comes on later to respond when this is posted to let us know if that's the eyes moment she meant. Because, he has eyes in every single scene he's in. So I want to make sure I have the right eyes. Okay, and Michael Little said, one of the worst episodes of a great season falls completely flat, just like my speaking. A chore to sit through, and the worst part, an invisible killer is a great idea for an X-File. I'm a big fan of Howard Gordon's work on the show. I always think of this episode as Howard Gordon rehash. I think it's... I should add that Howard Gordon did work with Chris Carter some on this episode because he was having trouble completing it. And I think if they had just gone about it in terms of around Skinner rather than Skinner being in charge of the operation, they might have gotten a lot more mileage out of it.
Yeah, because Mulder does a little bit, but Scully does, except for the small bits about the medical stuff. In general, the delivery by Anderson and Duchovny in this episode, that was one thing I was going to comment on, is really lifeless in a lot of points, especially during the cold open. Mulder, the line, he's here, I feel him, and then, I can't see him. There's somebody who has a gun who's about to shoot a general and has no tension in his delivery. And I could put that on Duchovny or the director, and I'll put it on both. It just kind of goes back again to the direction is also including the acting. There just isn't, from our two leads, there isn't much going on. And at that point, Skinner or Pileggi is doing a great job. So if they would have given it to him, I think that would have solved that issue too.
I think his performance in those scenes is, I get a lot of edgy from him, even though he's like, all he's saying is things like, does anyone have eyes on him? And, there's a tension there. And I think that's what I'm referring to in terms of his backstory is informing our story. So there's little expressly said until Mulder's big lines at the end. But we feel what Skinner has been through, and that's, of course, the genius of Mitch Pileggi. Okay, do you have any other comments or anything else on this episode before we wrap up?
I have a few small ones. That I did like that shot where they're at the right hand, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier, and Mulder's looking out towards the woods, and there's that small figure of Tiger, and then it pans back and disappears. That's something I think could have been done more, a little more spooky aesthetic. The other thing I was going to comment about some of the direction, I mentioned the dog. That's a small blooper with the gate. But there's a couple of scenes where, like, a fan is blowing. And it's so obvious. So at the very end where Tiger is dead and it pans up to a fan, it's a continuous take. And no one's hair is moving, no one's clothes are moving. You go up, and then the flag is just going crazy. Let's just maybe play it down a little bit. I think that happened at a different scene too, but it was that final one where you're supposed to be really dramatic and patriotism and look at this and how and then it's a minor point, but you can feel that things were rushed. And, again, they're doing the best they can. I feel so bad when you hear they made these things in like 8 days.
It's true.
Holy
it's true.
smokes. It's incredible. And if any of the creators are listening to this, you got our respect, hands down. We're just having fun.
Yes. Well, now I'm going to always think of the flag as going crazy whenever I see this episode again. That flag is going crazy.
It is. I mean, you should watch it when you're done. It is not a normal, it's an exciting day for that flag. I don't think I've seen that action since.
Oh my goodness. Oh, and let's talk about the art department having to make a memorial, because they can't use the actual memorial and they can't use real names of people. 2,000 names. 2,000 fake names made up just for a TV show. Didn't it look? It looks like the real thing.
They did an excellent job on that. And there were other scenes where they're trying to mask how big the crowd was at the event, and you can kind of tell where they've airbrushed and they're masking and everything. But that still looked good. They did a great job.
Yes.
I mean, I'm going to give the art department tons of credit on this one.
Absolutely. Okay, so Russ. Flag's going crazy. I'm seeing the flag billowing and, the light perfectly placed so that it could shine through, and seeing the whole thing now. I need a gif of this flag going crazy now.
We'll work on it.
Okay. So tell our fine listeners where they can find you on the World Wide Web.
Probably the best places in the X-Files basement and Facebook. I don't post a lot, but I occasionally do, and I try to keep up with the fun chat happening there.
There's always a great poll or something to think about, and everybody there they're good-hearted people. There's not,
Yep.
You were talking earlier about how fandom can jump in and claw, and there's none of that in the X-Files basement. I think that's why we're all there so much.
Exactly. This is one of the few healthy fan cultures I've ever found, and thankful to have found it and not have been ostracized yet. Knocking on the wood. Here we go.
Knocking. Okay. I do an X-Files rewatch blog with my sister called Sibling Cinema at Blogger. We can also be found with that moniker on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Tumblr, and Pinterest. So thanks so much for tuning in, and thanks to Ghosty. Thanks for coming on and talking about a show, even though you don't like it as much as some of the others.
But I like talking about it, and I like talking about it with you, Paige, so thank you for letting me join.
Oh, awesome. I hope we do it again soon. You're great to talk with.
Cheers. PFFs.
PFFs. And remember, as always, trust no one.
The X-Cast, an X-Files podcast, is produced and presented by Tony Black, alongside a dedicated group of podcasters and X-Files fans. You can find us on Twitter at The X-Cast, and on Facebook if you type in The X-Cast, or at our group, X-Files Basement, an X-Cast podcast fan group, where you can continue the discussion about all things Mulder and Scully. If you want to support The X-Cast further, you can now subscribe and become a patron of the show on Patreon. On Google, just type patreon.com/The X-Cast. That's Patreon. You'll see all of our tiers, subscription options and perks, which include early access to episodes, bonus content such as commentaries on X-Files episodes, access to a patron chat zone, and even appearing on one of our patron roundtable discussions. We would appreciate any support you can give the show, so just go to patreon.com/The Xcast to find out more. Our title music is provided courtesy of Will A, who you can find on Twitter at IamWillAYE.